I'd like to introduce Grant Schellenberg as our next speaker. Grant, welcome to Vancouver. Grant is an associate fellow of CIFAR's program in social interactions, identity, and well-being. And he's the acting director of the Social Analysis Division at Statistics Canada, where he leads analytical programs in the area of immigration, labor market adjustment, pensions and retirement, and well-being. Grant is also involved with several projects at Stats Canada on subjective well-being, such as the life satisfaction of recent immigrants, the relationship between life satisfaction and neighborhood income, and an assessment of life satisfaction responses across different Stats Canada surveys and survey years. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that in a moment. I think he set the cat among the pigeons a couple of days ago, didn't you? Prior to joining Stats Canada in 2003, Grant was the director of work networks at the CPRN, or the Canadian Policy Research Network. Grant, welcome.
Great. Thanks you so much for coming out, and thank you so much for having me on such an esteemed panel. The core of Statistics Canada's mandate is to provide high-quality information on issues that matter to Canadians, and what would matter more to Canadians than their well-being. And my primary objective this afternoon is to draw your attention to the rich and growing evidence base that we have on subjective well-being here in Canada, and to provide one example on how this increasingly rich and growing evidence base can be used to further our understanding of well-being in Canada. I'm pleased to say that StatsCan first collected information on subjective well-being, and specifically the extent to which people are satisfied with their lives, an evaluative component of well-being. And we included that on the General Social Survey back in 1985. But since 2003, life satisfaction has been included on surveys in a more concerted way, and the evidence base has grown quite quickly in the last while. So since 2003, we've asked a similar life satisfaction question on the General Social Survey, or what I'll refer to as the GSS. And since 2009, we've been asking the same question on the Canadian Community Health Survey, which I'll refer to as the CCHS. The GSS is an annual survey of approximately 15 to 25,000 respondents. And each year, the GSS cycle collects information on a thematic topic, such as time use, victimization, family. In 2013, it was on social belonging and social identity. And the CCHS is an annual survey of 65,000 respondents that collects information on various health issues. On both of those surveys, for the years I've shown up there, we asked this question using a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 means very dissatisfied and 10 means very satisfied. How do you feel about your life as a whole right now? And this is the evaluative component. We're not asking about people how happy they feel at that point in time, but we're asking them to evaluate it in a more abstract sense, if you wish. Now, the availability of this question across this wide range of surveys allows us to do a couple of things. The first thing it allowed us to do was to compare the life satisfaction question across a broad range of survey contexts to see how people responded to the question. Was the question volatile? Do people seem to get it? Does it depend a lot on what the context and on what we're asking them? And are the covariates, or the factors that are related to life satisfaction, consistent across surveys and over time? And so we did some work on this, and what we discovered was survey respondents are able and willing to answer the life satisfaction question. Very few people refuse or say they don't know or leave it blank. There was a few small changes on the life satisfaction question since 2003, but those had a minimal impact on overall response patterns. When we used the GSS time use survey and we knew exactly what day and what month and so on that people completed this survey, we found that the life satisfaction responses are not at all correlated with the day of the week that people completed the survey or the month of the year in which they completed the survey. And we see very high level of consistency in responses across the CCHS, that is the Canadian Community Health Survey with its consistent survey context, but greater variability across the general social survey, and we see that this is correlated with the other types of content that's in there. And importantly, we also see that the direction and the magnitude of the relationships between socioeconomic characteristics like being unemployed or having a higher or lower income or age or education or marital status are very consistent across these surveys. So the long and the short of this is it gives us a great deal of confidence in what we're measuring has validity and is meaningful to people. And this is very consistent with the broad literature in the academic world as well. The other thing that having all of these surveys and these questions on these various surveys and survey years is it allows us to pool the data to group it. And what this does is it provides very large sample sizes that any single survey would not allow to address questions that any single survey would not allow us to address. So for this study that I'm going to turn to in a moment, we used the 3 or 4 cycles or so of the CCHS and I think 5 cycles of the GSS, and it gave us a pooled sample of almost 340,000 Canadians over the period from 2009 to 2013. And as an aside, we'll be able to add another 130,000 people to that sample in a few months from now. So we've got a tremendous depth here by which we can look at Canadian society, and this is very useful. So, what do the responses of these individuals look like? The simple distribution here, what we see is that average life satisfaction in Canada is just a hair under 8.0 out of a scale of 10. And there are no thresholds above or below which someone is deemed to be satisfied or dissatisfied with their life. But what we see here is that 38% of Canadians score a 9 or 10 on the scale, and 70% score an 8, 9, or 10. So generally, people are quite satisfied in Canada, and that's certainly consistent with the World Happiness Report, where Canada ranks quite high on an international standing. If we look at the lower end of the scale, about 14% of Canadians, or about 1 in 7, have a life satisfaction score of 6 or less. Now, with that backdrop in mind, let's take a look across cities. And what we're using here is the StatsCan concept of the census metropolitan area, which is the urban area of Vancouver or wherever. So what we see here is average life satisfaction. And just coming back, not to get too hung up on sample size here, but in Vancouver, we have 17,000 respondents who completed this question over that time period. In Toronto, we had 30,000 respondents. So again, very robust estimates here. So in the midpoint, we see Canada with an average life satisfaction of just under 8.0. And the green bars above are the census metropolitan areas that have life satisfaction that's significantly higher compared to the Canadian average. And you'll notice these whisker plots here. This is the 95% confidence interval. So there's error around these estimates. So in Calgary, for example, the estimate could be, this is the real estimate here, or what we observe. It could be as low as this, or it could be as high as that. So it gives you some sense of what's the magnitude of error. And for some very small CMAs, such as Abbotsford, you see that this confidence interval is a little bit wider. So if we're going to compare, say, Kelowna and Montreal, well, you see there's an overlapping there, so don't make too much of this small difference. So what do we see? Saguenay, Trois-Rivières, St. John's, Greater Sudbury, Quebec, many CMAs consistently quite higher, up at around 8.2 on our 10-point scale. Down towards the bottom, the orange bars are those that are statistically significant from the Canadian average. So Toronto, Vancouver, Windsor, with average life satisfaction scores around 7.8. Now, what do we want to make about this degree of magnitude? I think the first important point to be made here is when we compare life satisfaction across countries of the world, the range of difference is about 10 times bigger than what we see across these 33 census metropolitan areas. So this is a very constrained distribution relative to the international context. But nonetheless, we have almost a 0.45 spread between the lowest and the highest CMA on life satisfaction. And when we look at marital status or unemployment status, that's a similar coefficient to what we're seeing across that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, averages tell us one thing, but let's look at some specific spots along the distribution. This chart shows the percent of individuals rating their life satisfaction as a 9 or a 10. I've used the 9 and the 10 in quite an arbitrary way. And what we see here is, again, at the top, we've got upwards of 40 to 45% of Canadians in these specific CMAs with a 9 or a 10 on their life satisfaction, down to less than 35% in Toronto, Vancouver, Barrie, Edmonton. So overall, approximately a 11 percentage point difference in the share of Canadians across CMAs who are at the high end. If we broaden this and say, okay, well, what about those guys who scored 8? They're pretty happy too. Well, if we look at that and who scored 8, 9, or 10, and we have a 14 percentage point difference across census metropolitan areas. At the other end of the scale, we saw earlier about 14% of people score 6 or less on the life satisfaction scale. And again, Saguenay, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, that share is less than 10%. And then again, Abbotsford, Toronto, and Windsor, upwards of 16 to 17% of individuals ranking their life satisfaction as 6 or below. Now, the objective of this study was not to document and explain the broad range or to explain the variance across CMAs, but rather to highlight the fact that these differences are there. But nonetheless, what factors might explain these differences? And we can at least start to address this. So it may be the case, and I'll come to this in just a minute, it may be the case that there's more unemployed folks in a certain CMA, or there's more immigrants in Vancouver and Toronto than there are in the Saguenay, or that household incomes might vary across these CMAs, and it might be that the cumulative effect of the characteristics of the individuals in these CMAs are indeed what account for the differences that we're observing. So what we did is we ran some statistical analysis, and what this shows is how much relative to the reference group specific characteristics, and I've just selected some here, how much specific characteristics are associated with differences in life satisfaction. So women are slightly more happy or more satisfied with their life than men. Immigrants slightly less. Compared to individuals who are married, the coefficient for individuals who are separated or divorced, they're minus 0.6 on that 10-point scale, or those who are widowed are about a minus 4.6 on that scale. Compared to individuals who are employed, the unemployed have the unemployment has a negative effect of about 0.5. And similarly, you see the impact here for household differences across household income relative to those who have a household income of 100 to 150,000. And again, you see the strong correlation with self-assessed health. Now, if we take all of these characteristics into account, how much of the difference across census metropolitan areas remain? Well, in fact, most of it, about 85 to 90%. So a very small share is actually explained by these individual level characteristics. The other thing that might come to mind is Toronto and Vancouver certainly are at the bottom of that distribution, so maybe it's strictly an urban size effect, that large cities that have something to do with negative impact on life satisfaction. So what I'm showing in this last slide here is we've done two things. We've adjusted for individual level socioeconomic characteristics, as I've mentioned, and we just did a simple categorization for CMAs that have less than 250,000 to $1 million, and then large CMAs. So even there, we see Toronto with life, this is the percent scoring 8, 9, and 10. So about 65% of the residents of Toronto, after adjusting for individual level characteristics, score an 8, 9, or 10, compared to 71 or 72% in Montreal. If we look across small CMAs, certainly I think there is sort of there's a size effect, but I think what's striking here is, again, controlling for these characteristics. Places like Barrie and Guelph The percent, around 65, 66% of individuals scoring an 8, 9, or 10, again with the adjustment, compared to over 75% of some of the Quebec CMAs. So quite clearly, there's considerable variation here. So looking ahead, I guess my key point to be made here is that information on life satisfaction is increasingly deep and rich. That our cumulative sample of respondents that we have in these surveys continues to grow, and that we could get both more robust estimates for the CMAs we've shown here, and we also have scope to disaggregate these census metropolitan areas into smaller geographies. With the addition of the sample I mentioned coming up, we'll have 22 to 24,000 responses for Vancouver alone. So if we want to look at Richmond, Port Coquitlam, West Van, and so on, we could start to dig deeper. And as we do that across CMAs, it gives us more units of analysis to look at, and we can extend our analysis. The other thing that's happening is the range of characteristics or covariates that we have for examining life satisfaction of individuals continues to increase. So we hear that there's that the importance of identity or social belonging, of participation, of people's ties with others is an important correlate or determinant of life satisfaction. So with a survey like the GSS on social identity, we can dig much deeper into that. And as we get as we get cross-sectional files over time, that we do have increasing scope to track life satisfaction over time among specific groups for identifying broad trends. And there's been some work in Canada suggesting or showing a large increase in life satisfaction in the province of Quebec relative to the rest of Canada. And as we have data from 2000 onward, we have a span of 12 years. It won't be long before we'll have 20 years of data to track those trends. Nonetheless, I think building on the previous studies to identify the factors accounting for inter-CMA differences in life satisfaction there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done. But I think we are fortunate in Canada that we have a rich database and rich information to bring statistical information to the qualitative work that we see at the ground level as well. And it's the combination of those two things that I think is particularly powerful. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Grant. Look forward to hearing the questions from the audience and comments for the two of you and for our next guest. And by the way, in terms of interaction, questions, comments, exploration of some of the things that you're doing, all of that is welcome, and we can do it in a couple of ways. We're going to have mics move around the audience, or you can come up front here and ask the question and have a little bit of a dialogue with our panelists.